We're here today with Chanel Powe, Governing Board President of the Balls School District in Phoenix, Arizona. Thank you for coming.
I'm so excited to be here today.
It's nice to have you on Issues of Education. You know, our program has dealt with so many different issues across the board, from pedagogy to finance, but student discipline is one that really hasn't been given the attention that it has. I guess a number of other issues has overshadowed it.
You know, as a parent, you know, my son going to school, even from kindergarten, I realized that he was getting suspended from school. And as a parent, I felt powerless. Mm-hmm. So I would talk to the school and I would start to hear certain type of labels that would be, his behavior is erratic, or we don't understand why he's behaving this way. Then it was his haircut. Possibly he could be in a gang. And I'm like, well, my son's only in 5th grade. So as a governing board member, you know, I have an obligation to our students and families within our community to ensure if this is a national issue, let's scale it down to the local level and ask ourselves, are we contributing to this problem, or are we doing something new and innovative? So the first thing that school districts should do, and I would also encourage parents to do, is to ask for the student discipline data. Once you receive that data, let's disaggregate that data. And what we notice is a sharp contrast of African American boys in particular are likely to be suspended 8 times likely as their white students. Angela Davis was our keynote yesterday for the CUBE luncheon, and she discussed the direct correlation between education outcomes and the prison system, and I thought that that was just very profound. So some would say, or some think, and some people actually believe that black students are bad or worse than any other children, and that's just not true. When we look at black girls, I brought this pamphlet with me. The National Women Lawyers Association has something called Let Her Learn. I started seeing videos and viral videos about little black girls who are embracing their natural hair, and braids are getting cut out of their head by teachers. Young girls are being suspended because their hair is called a distraction when it just grows out of their head. And again, by looking at that data, they're being called aggressive, bossy, when in actuality these are leadership qualities that should be cultivated, opposed to labeled or stereotyped. And I cannot forget our indigenous family and community. We noticed that our indigenous students are also disproportionately impacted. And if you are a thought leader, you want to think to yourself, historically, what has been the flight of Native Americans? And this all ties in to trauma.
Interesting.
So if the kids are acting out, if I haven't had breakfast this morning, or if I went to sleep on a cold floor with no hot water, it may seem like I have a chip on my shoulder if I come into the classroom. That's why it's imperative that teachers have a particular training called Adverse Childhood Experiences. I'm very grateful for the work by a woman named Marcia Stan at Phoenix Children's Hospital, who has really studied these different layers of childhood trauma. And I want to be clear when I say childhood trauma, that could be a death in the family, it could be a loss of a parent in the home, it could be an incarcerated parent, it could be a loss of a job, it could be poverty, and it could be a number of things. But what we're noticing in Arizona is a lot of our students have at least 2 of these childhood traumas, but students of color are having 6 or more. So we need to do a better job of a system, and please let me be clear too, there's a lot being asked of school districts. There is so much being asked, there's more being asked of us nowadays than ever. And we are working diligently, and we cannot ignore these problems that are seeping into the classroom. But if a kid is coming into the classroom, we need to learn how to meet them with understanding opposed to discipline.
So you're setting up these standards, these policies. How do you share that kind of sensitivity and insight at all the levels? The teacher level, the principal level, SRO,
We don't have SROs in our school.
don't.
And let me be very clear, SROs in public schools, there's no data that supports having their physical presence on a campus makes schools safer.
Okay.
And we notice that SROs sometimes get involved in student discipline matters. And that's where things can escalate.
Right.
And we see students being handcuffed and arrested. That's already a trauma. Handcuffed and arrested. And particularly with students of color now, one out of three black men will go to jail at some point in their life. 1 out of 3. And it starts as a juvenile.
Sure.
So if they're arrested one time, the likelihood of them getting arrested again and being repetitive really raises the stakes. This not only impacts our local communities, but it also impacts our economy if we don't have individuals contributing to society. So we have to be very thoughtful and look at our data and start asking ourselves some questions. Are we doing everything that we can to be trauma informed? And there is no silver bullet. Something that our school district did is we adopted something called Restorative Practices, where we have a member or we have an employee that comes in and specifically works with student conflict. And the Restorative Practices model suggests that we have the victim and the perpetrator discuss their issues and how did it arise to this point so that we can have restoration. And if the perpetrator needs help, we want to get them the help that they need or the support that they need so that they don't have to commit any type of acts against another student, if that makes sense.
It does.
Because, sometimes students can get into a fight, and this is why having that racial bias training is so critical. Because if a student is being called a racial slur and the teacher say, okay, well, we took care of it. Well, did you really take care of it?
Yeah, probably not.
Probably not. And then that student who was getting picked on, they feel like nobody is listening to them. And sometimes they may lash out physically. And I'm not saying that it's okay to condone any type of violence, but how do we mitigate that and disrupt that before it even happens so that we can keep our kids in the classroom? Because ultimately, that's our goal.
I've heard the phrase 3 strikes and you're out. At what the trauma that was very enlightening. At what point does a child reach that number of disciplines where you have to do something different?
So, we do have tiers. And there are certain instances where a case-by-case situation is evaluated by having a hearing. The board is not involved in that situation, but it could possibly come to the board, any type of recommendations. If the student is causing harm or possibly causing harm to themselves or others and it continues to escalate, we don't expel our students. There may be a recommendation for alternative school, but let's not forget that student is still going to have some social, emotional issues that they're dealing with. And I believe that that's at the core a lot of those issues. So if we can do the best that we can as a school district to try to provide them with resources, also with counselors, but we all know that there is a shortage in counselors, but that's because we need to be very much more intentional about where we're allocating our funds.
It's interesting when you talk about the child. It must be very confusing to them because the rules are probably applied differently by different teachers for different reasons, and what is acceptable to one, let's say, teacher, because they have similar kids at home, or they happen to teach sports on weekends, and they're used to dealing with kids at a different level. And I would just think it's confusing for a student because I've seen students where they'll get in a fight on the playground, and depending on what adult comes to that area, they break it up, and it's managed differently than somebody else coming that find out that fight is not at all acceptable. And I'm using a fight. It could be something else, and you're expelled. It's like, wait a second. Does the punishment fit the crime?
I feel like we need to get to the root cause to know why it happened, what occurred.
Okay.
Instead of, we're going to kick you out of school, why did you do that? Let's get to the root cause. Like, what are you dealing with? And if you have issues that you're dealing with, the school is here to support you because we want to support you on your educational journey. This is why our school district adopted a motto called SEED. That's a social, emotional, academic development. We believe in the whole child. We don't believe that kids are bad.
Right.
We need to know what kids are going through that's bringing forth these behavioral outcomes. And what can we do to redirect them opposed to writing them off into society where it could be detrimental again when we look to our future and the young people now who are going to be making decisions. We want to make sure that they are in tune with their feelings, but also that they know how to cope with different situations. And I really do enjoy the restorative practices because what that does is it gives them an opportunity to talk things out and to be heard and also be able to hear from the perpetrator to understand why this occurred so that there is no more sand or no more disruption in the learning process. And now we have learned how to move on, or we have learned how to discuss things and talk them out, opposed to being reactionary to situations that possibly can make a student uncomfortable.
Well, as the board president, you have a really tough job because part of what the board, you're the last resort. They come to you last, sometimes first, but you send them back through that process. But you have policies.
We do.
And for all kinds of reasons, whether it's legal or otherwise, you have those policies. And if you enforce those policies inconsistently, then you create another set of issues. So you have to be consistent, and sometimes, unfortunately, so.
No, you're absolutely right. We do have to set forth those policies. There is another issue that we see in student discipline. We call it dress coded. This is also another campaign by the National Women Lawyers Association, where students that are low income and majority students of color, and we see a lot with young black girls, that they're being suspended because some of their clothes may be fitting too tight. But if you're low income and your parents can't afford to buy you new clothes every year, they may not fit. Yeah. So once again, we're taking a child who needs to be enriching their education in the classroom out of the classroom for something that's outside of their control. So instead of meeting students with discipline, we need to meet them with understanding. Once again, if a student is arrested in school, it sets them up for a future. I mean, we have seen students go to juvenile, and I'm not saying particularly in my district, but I'm just saying in general, we have seen students go from juvenile and on their 18th birthday get walked right over to the adult prison. Now let's start looking at this prison population and who's incarcerated. Right now, there are more black men incarcerated than there were slaves in 1850. And that's disproportionate. And is it because African Americans are more severe? It starts at the root of the policies. So I would encourage governing boards and school districts to ensure that they don't have zero tolerance policies. We have seen zero tolerance policies negatively impact our black and brown students. And what that does is that over incarcerates them, and it takes men and women out of their homes and away from their families, opposed to having that holistic lifestyle that every child and every family deserves.
So what was the cause of that zero tolerance policy? What brought that about?
I don't know why
Is that
some
the easy
schools.
way out?
It's the easy way out.
Yeah.
Just get them out of here.
Yeah.
teachers, and I understand it's a lot being a teacher, but if teachers, I also think that it's important to support teachers in their wellness and their mental wellness. And I think that we also need to understand that we have to understand the students in which we serve. It is hard for a middle-aged white woman in suburbia to come to an urban school district and say, oh, well, I know that they have problems, but no, let's look at the root cause. Why do they have problems? Why are they economically disenfranchised? Why don't they have resources to ensure that there is nutrition and food on the table and that the bills are paid? We have to ask ourselves and dig a little bit deeper. Sometimes the child behavior is a product of the home that they're coming from, and as a school and as educators, our job is to do the best we can to try to help that whole child, because once we get them back focused and nourished, we can electrify their minds and help them explore their imagination and keep them in school and in the classroom. You know, we have a problem with dropout rates in Arizona. It is no secret that the opportunity gap between 16 and 24 who are not working and who are not going to school, instead of writing them off or arresting them or just kicking them out, we need to reinvest in them. And we have an opportunity to do that at the elementary school level. What can a kindergartner do to get suspended from school?
It'd be pretty
What
tough.
can they do? But it happens.
Did it really?
It does happen. It happens.
That'd be pretty tough.
And you know, I would implore my colleagues here. I would implore them to take a look at. I almost forgot what I was going to say. I would implore them to take a look at restorative practices, and also to look at their student suspension rates between the grades of preschool and second grade.
Okay.
Those numbers are astounding. I believe in 2017, 250,000 preschoolers were suspended from school.
My gosh.
So what we can identify is that we need to uproot these harmful policies, and we need to rethink. We also need to be mindful that the children that are suffering from childhood trauma, ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, to think about investing more so in counselors so we can help our students heal and restore themselves, opposed to taking the easy way out and referring to the office or kicking them outside of the classroom when they need to get as much instruction as possible so that they can be productive members of society.
Well, what I'm understanding here is obviously the focus is on the students. That's why the system, school district exists.
Sure.
But your focus has to be on every adult that comes in contact with that child.
It's very important, and sometimes those are difficult conversations to have.
The most.
But when people say that those are difficult conversations, I'm like, difficult for who? Because I'm still a black woman, and I'm reminded everywhere I go till this day, and there are systems and structures in place that prevent me from even making a full dollar to have equitable pay. Also in leadership position and roles where we're vastly underrepresented. So we need to take a step back and look at these policies and practices and start doing things different. You know, one of our schools, Crockett Elementary, we have something called mindfulness training, where we have a mindfulness room. So instead of saying, you know what, Johnny is being bad, I can't take him, get him out of my classroom, go to the office. It's not a timeout room. And that's harmful to children, isolating them and putting them in these rooms without interaction with other children. That actually can be detrimental to their neurology system. So I would recommend the wellness room. Let's go regroup. Because in real life, when you become an adult, things may not always go your way, and you can be frustrated and upset, but we just can't always walk out. And if we could teach our children that at the elementary grade level, while their brains are still developing, we can produce phenomenal members of our society who will also contribute. Because we don't want them to just leave the school and just leave the community. We have to make that reinvestment into the next generation. So again, I would just encourage my school board members and my district leaders to take a look at your student discipline record and ask yourself, are we doing something new and innovative, or are we adding to the school to prison pipeline?